Right, Morena councillors. Let's make a start. Welcome to this representation review committee. Whakatakata hau ki te uru, whakatakata hau ki te tonga kia makina kina ki uta, kia mataratara ki tai, he iaka ana te atakura he tio, he huka, he hauhu, tihei Māori ora. First order of business is apologies. I've got one apology from Councillor Duthie. He's the only one. Can I have a mover and a seconder, please? Councillor Saw, Councillor Ropata. All those in favour, please say aye. Those opposed, no. It's carried. Conflict of interest declarations. Okay. In a sense, I wonder whether we're all conflicted in this conversation, and these decisions were better made by somebody else rather than the regional council, and they may be. Francis, Will, can I turn over to you to provide some context before we move to submitter?
Ata Mārie councillors. This morning you are called on to consider the submissions received on your initial representation proposal for the 2025 triennial elections, and to then, having considered those submissions, to formulate your recommendation to council as to the nature of a final proposal. And that final proposal would be considered by council on the 31st of October, and then depending on the nature of that final proposal, there'll be a period for appeals and possibly objections to that. And if there are any received, or if the council's final proposal doesn't comply with the plus or minus 10% rule of fair representation, the issue will be put to the Local Government Commission for determination by the 11th of April next year. So you have two papers before you. The first one's a process paper, standard process paper, and the second paper is with regard to the submissions received. At this stage, open to the floor as to whether there are any questions with regard to those papers in terms of questions of clarification.
So, question clarification, because it's sort of arisen in other conversations, is a question, Francis, about the extent to which the council is now able to adapt any of the options that were on the table, as opposed to going precisely with the options that on the table. In other words, if there's a halfway position on in terms of finding a solution that we can live with around the table, is that possible, or do we have to? Are we locked into the options that we went out to?
In essence, the council is required under statute and also the guidelines issued by the Local Government Commission to make a decision based on its consideration of submissions. So therefore, it's the matters raised in the submissions that provide the scope for any amendments that the council could make to its initial proposal. If I give an example, in this instance, there are no submissions with regard to the membership of a Wairarapa constituency, for example. So really that matter is not within the scope of this meeting to consider, because it falls outside the range of submissions that have come to the committee. However, if taking into account the submissions and the nature of those, the committee were to formulate a proposal that has some variation between what the council has proposed and the submissions, that may be possible based on its consideration of the matters raised in those submissions.
Okay. Any other questions, Councillor Staples?
Thank you. My question is around the use of the population. Are we required under the Act to use the electoral population as opposed to the population of of the ward?
Yes. So this is the first review where a Maori constituency is involved. So with there being a Maori constituency, the electoral population is divided into two parts. So there's the Maori electoral population, which applies to the Maori constituency, and then there's the general electoral population that applies to the general constituencies. So that is the total population minus the Maori electoral population, which gives you the general electoral population. So for the general constituencies, you are applying the general electoral population.
Mr. Chair, that wasn't quite what I was trying to get an answer for, Francis. The electoral population is different to the population of the ward as a whole, because you have people that haven't registered, people that are under 18 can't vote yet. So what I'm asking is, are we required under the Act to use the electoral population as opposed to the total population of the ward?
Yes, but we're not using the electoral roll population. That's a different consideration. If we were just using the standard population estimates for the region, it would be 550,300. The Māori electoral population of that is 45,000, and the general electoral population is therefore approximately the balance. So 510,300. So this is the population, the actual people in the region, usually resident. It's not to do with those under 18. Well, it incorporates everybody. It's not exclusionary of any population. No, no.
Okay, further questions? There will be further questions once we have considered or heard from the submitter. Okay, thank you. Mr. Compton, I think you're probably aware that you are the only submitter, so it's a standard 5 minutes, and then we'll move to questions from that. So we're in your hands.
Kia ora katoa, ko Gwen Compton toko ingoa, ko Ramataka Tamanga, ko Mangaroa Te Awa, no Paraparu Umu Aho. Morena committee members, I'm Gwen Compton. I'm a former district councillor on the Kapiti Coast, and I'm very familiar with the process you're going through at the moment, having gone through what was a very contentious representation review here in Kapiti last triennium. So as you mentioned, only the one submitted today. I see you've only had the 2 written submissions, so I think I can safely assume that you've read both of the submissions you've received. There's 3 things I wanted to emphasise in my submission today, and they are the issue of fair representation, the broader question of how many elected representatives are needed on a regional council for it to operate, and whether having a reduced number of elected members might impact the diversity of views and experience on Greater Wellington. Now, as you'll be familiar with, the Local Government Act considers the question of fair representation not just ensuring that communities of interest are actually represented on the council, but actually that the share of their voice, the balance across the region, is they attempt to make it as equal as possible, so that no one constituency is over or underrepresented by too much of an amount. And that's obviously the plus and minus 10% rule that Francis referred to earlier, that results in things quite often going to the Local Government Commission. Now, the Commission's previously accepted Kapiti's under-representation as a necessary evil to ensure that Kapiti had its standalone representation and it wasn't merged with another constituency, as has previously been suggested a number of years ago, I think, merging it with Porirua. And now, interestingly, despite the Commission having taken a similar stance on a similar long-term underrepresentation issue, which was here in Kapiti with the Waikanae ward on KCDC, they actually changed their tune in the most recent 2022 determination on Kapiti's representation review. And it said that this 25% underrepresentation for Waikanae, which had persisted, funnily enough, for around 2 decades, which is similar to Kapiti's underrepresentation on Greater Wellington, it said that it wasn't fair anymore. It wasn't providing adequate representation or an adequate voice for the residents of Waikanae and KCDC. So it changed KCDC's representation proposal and took one of the district-wide councillors and popped it into Waikanae. And it had the magical effect of making all KCDC wards compliant within that plus minus 10% rule, which was, a great and easy solution for them to make. Now, obviously, Greater Wellington doesn't have that luxury because of the cap of 14 councillors under the Local Government Act in terms of regional councillors. So there's no region-wide pool that you can reallocate a councillor to Kapiti from. And in doing so, you would have made a massive over-representation for Kapiti instead, which would be nice after 2 decades of under-representation, but, it's one of those fundamentally unfair things. So this is why in my proposal, I've encouraged you to consider adopting scenario 2 from the 27 August officers report with the 10 general constituency members, which have the boundaries that nicely align with the territorial authorities, and the 1 Māori constituency councillor as well. And what works nicely about that in my mind is that it sees nearly all the general constituencies fall within that plus minus 10% rule. So you're getting a better balance of voices from across the region in terms of how those votes are going to be counted going to be exercised at the council table. So no one region is unnecessarily, overrepresented versus another. Well, the only one that does get overrepresented is Upper Hutt, which sits at 12.1%, which is only just a pinch outside of that, the tolerance level. And the case I'd make there is that surely a situation where all constituencies have their voices more or less evenly weighted on the council is a far fairer situation than what's included in the draft proposal, or what is the current the status quo. Because it's, this underrepresentation has been worsening over the past 2 decades, and it just simply can't be accepted or rationally defended anymore by anyone who values fairness at all. And I know that many of you claim to be passionate advocates about the importance of fairness in local democracy. So then, let's say you decide to go for this 11-member council, there's a question about whether that's enough to run a regional council. And that's a fair question. It's one I pondered when I was looking at it as well. So I actually had a look across all the regional and unitary authorities, and there's no golden rule in terms of the number of councillors to population or committee size or council size or that sort of thing. It's very much a horses for courses approach. You've got things like Northland Regional Council. It covers 12,000 square kilometres, so it's about 50% bigger than Wellington. There's 200,000 people. And they've got 9 elected members, and their infrastructure and their ability to get around their region, if you've been up there, is not quite the same as it is down here in the Wellington region. You've got Auckland, which is the unitary authority. They're doing both your job and the job of territorial authorities. They've got 21 elected members across 1.7 million. So they're looking at about 82,000 people per elected member. And they're looking after a smaller area. I think it's about 4,500 square kilometres. But the most comparable regional council to Wellington, I think, is probably Environment Canterbury. That has 14 elected members. It's got 2 Ngāi Tahu representatives who are appointed by Ngāi Tahu, and they serve 666,000 people across 44,000 square kilometres, so roughly 5 times the size of what Greater Wellington covers. And they also cover some of the most challenging water catchments and environmental issues in the country. Now, if you look at their ratio of elected members to their population, they land at something like 1 for every 47,000, which actually isn't far off that scenario 2 what that has, which is 1 for every 50,000 people. Now, I wouldn't suggest that's a magical ratio, but I think it indicates in terms of the workload for councillors that sort of ratio is in the ballpark of what's still manageable for elected members. And then the final point was the question of whether reducing Greater Wellington's elected members to 10 general constituency spots would impact diversity on the council. And if you've got concerns about that, I'd actually encourage you to have better faith in our region. You know, if you look across the Wellington region in recent years, the electors here, they elected Tory Whānau to the Wellington mayoralty, they elevated Tamantha Poole to Parliament for Wellington Central, Julianne Genter won Rongotai, and Kay Guranathan served 2 terms as mayor up in here in Kapiti. So I think, you know, the voters reward good candidates, and they'll continue to do so. I think we're a very proudly progressive region. So in the interest of fairness, I want to encourage the committee to vote to make the final proposal, that scenario 2 option, with the 10 general constituency councillors and the 1 councillor from the Māori constituency. Thank you for your time this morning, and I'd welcome any questions.
Thank you, Mr. Compton. Questions? Councillors? So I've got a question. Mine is around the Kapiti constituency, and a question about whether you had considered moving the southern boundary of the district, so that there was effectively less population covered and the equity that overhang effectively, or underhang depending on how you see it, is reduced, possibly not to the plus or minus 10%, but closer to the plus or minus 10%.
So I think, Chair, you're talking about if you'd bring that southern boundary further north, so cleaving off something like Paikakariki into Porirua.
Correct.
I think then you're going to run into the communities of interest question, which the Commission will consider, and it's whether the people of Paikakariki have more in common with the Porirua constituency or a Kapiti Coast constituency. And I suspect Paikakariki would probably tell you that, you know, most of their interactions and lives would revolve around engagement north of them rather than Porirua. But, you know, it's a valid question to consider as well, if only because Paikakariki, you know, it sits in a slightly, you know, it's got its own little water catchment in terms of the Wainui stream and that sort of thing. So yeah, potentially it could work. Could help balance it off. It would be a small change. You'd have to go further north into Raumati to cleave off, I think, enough people to properly address it. But then you'd definitely be tripping over that communities of interest question.
Sure. Any Councillor Connolly?
Hi, thanks for your submission. It was a lot of food for thought, so I really appreciated the time you took to make it. Would you agree, though, that although regional councils are represented by or are elected to represent a ward or a community of interest, which is based on a geographical basis, that in fact all of us are, once elected, we're here to represent the whole of the Greater Wellington region. And I think we all do that extremely well. Our focus of interest, whilst we bring, you know, so I'm from Upper Hutt and I bring an Upper Hutt perspective, but I by no means limit my interest to what goes on in Upper Hutt, and I by no means limit the workload that I do to just matters that involve Upper Hutt. And so given that we all have a remit that is across Greater Wellington, wouldn't you agree that actually reducing the number of councillors or number of people around the table in effect will reduce the amount of representation that any one ward receives?
Absolutely not. I'd reject that. I'd say that the material change from 14 to 11 isn't going to be particularly high. The ratio is still the same. Well, the ratio is quite similar to ECAN. So unless you're suggesting that ECAN's underrepresented, I mean, maybe you could make that argument. Look, if that's your point of view, maybe GWRC should elect everyone region-wide and not have specific geographical constituencies. I think it's a nice little legal fiction that you're meant to go and govern for the region-wide, but your electors, I think, very definitely want you to have a very focus for their region. And I think this is one of the disconnects between local governance and the communities they serve. It's certainly one I experienced, and I was a district-wide councillor, so I was elected with the remit to go across the whole Kapiti Coast district, which was great. But you could see, our ward councillors struggling with the balance between what, their constituency that elected them was saying, hey, we want this for Otaki. They don't care what Paraparauumu's getting. We want Otaki to, get a new roof on the pool or a new pathway down here. They want to make sure that their community gets their fair share. So there's a natural tension. I completely acknowledge that, but I think your electors would like, they've got this natural thing that they want you to be that fearless advocate, and they want to make sure they get that fair share. And look, there's horse trading that you've got to make as elected members. I completely get that. I've had to do my fair share of that as well. But it is a challenge.
Yeah, Councillor Gallo.
Oh, thank you. Welcome, Gwyn. I just wanted to check in that, are you aware that Environment Canterbury don't actually do the public transport that we do?
Yep. But they also cover 8 times the land area than you do, and a lot more complex water catchments with, as I said, some of the most challenging water issues in the entire country, far more complex than what Greater Wellington is. The only people I think would be dealing with anything as contentious would be the likes of Waikato, in terms of the management of the Waikato River and that. So, as I said, it's a horses for courses approach, and I wasn't suggesting that ECAN had a magical ratio. I was more saying that in terms of that, it's comparable to what was covered off in scenario 2.
Okay, thank you.
David, nothing? Any other councillors? Okay, thank you, Mr. Compton. As Councillor Connolly said, appreciate the significant effort that you've put into to that submission. I can assure you that it was read by all councillors, because it's caused a bit of discussion even prior to this meeting. Okay, councillors.
Thank you.
Having heard that submission, do we have? Okay. Oh, okay.
Because Gwyn's just gone, I see, but your comment just then, I haven't had any discussions with anybody. So is there some amendments or other discussions?
No, coming to that.
Okay.
So,
right.
No, there haven't been any conversations. What you? Sorry. In terms of, yes, there have been conversations, because the submission was well written, and it did cause issues for consideration, and those issues are going to play out around this table now, I would have thought. But no, there have been nothing that has led to any change in approach. That's for this meeting. Yeah. Okay. So what we've got on the table, and I'll get Francis to go through these, is the alternative proposals that you may have in front of you. So Francis will talk through alternative proposal 1, 2A and 2B.
For that discussion, councillors, I suggest you refer to attachment 2 in the second report before you, where we outline the submitters' proposed amendments with the officer comments. Page 23. So while Mr. Compton focused on the first proposal in his presentation to you today, that is also a proposal that the second submitter, Mr. Wilson Goldman, has made the same submission on, and there are 2 other proposals contained in their submissions. So the first one is the council of 11 members. The constituencies would align with territorial authority boundaries. So what that means is that there would be one change to the current constituency arrangements through the Tawa area, returning into the boundaries of what would be a Wellington city constituency. So Tawa would be excluded from the Porirua constituency, and the total number of members would be 11, including a Māori constituency member. So for the general constituencies, if you think of the current framework, in addition to that boundary alteration, it would mean that the Wellington constituency would have one less member, the Lower Hutt constituency one less member, and the it just escapes me now, the other constituency, Porirua, yes, because Tawa is excluded from Porirua. The Porirua constituency would have one less member. Now, I've set that out for how that looks from a statistical perspective on page 26. And as Mr. Compton mentioned, that means that from a fair representation perspective, all the constituencies would comply with the plus or minus 10% rule, with the exception of Upper Hutt, which would be overrepresented by 2.1% above the 10% threshold. In our officer comments on that proposal, I've identified there the matters that officers consider would be appropriate for the committee to consider in relation to this proposal, being taking into account, does that provide effective representation for the region as a whole, taking into account a number of considerations that are set out there. Then I'll just briefly cover the other two propositions, which are set out on page 24. So those propositions would retain the current constituency boundaries, and for the most part, the membership. So it would be 13 general constituency councillors as the councillors proposed, but it would amend it in two options. Kapiti would increase to one general constituency member, either through reducing the Paniki Wellington general constituency from 5 to 4, or the Te Awa Kairangi ki Tai Lower Hutt general constituency from 3 to 2 members. So really this is about the distribution of members across the council in terms of the constituencies, and in the table on the right hand side it shows you what those changes would mean. So the Kapiti Coast general constituency under the council's proposal is currently underrepresented by 37.4%. It would again under scenario A change to 31.3% overrepresentation, or in B it would be the same. Paniki Wellington would go from 1.2% overrepresentation to 23.6% underrepresentation if that option were chosen. And Te Awa Kairangi ki Tai Lower Hutt would move from 13.1% overrepresentation to 30.3% underrepresentation. So this mix of options 2A and 2B is really about the distribution of councillors. It's not proposing any change to the constituency boundaries, names, etc. So that's a brief overview, Chair. And again, for that option, I've set out at the bottom there what we as officers recommend you consider in working through that option.
Okay, I'm not proposing that we take a move and a seconder at this stage, because I think we need the ability to just discuss this a bit more openly. So the floor is open for discussion. Councillor Staples.
Thanks, Mr. Chair. Since receiving this submission, it's fair to say I've gone back over the original paper, and I'm sure, like my colleagues, we've all done a lot of reading, and because he's raised some good points, I think, in the paper. In my experience in local government, there are always councillors that do more than others. It's just a fact of some councillors put more into the job than others do. And so I don't see, if we were to look at a smaller number of 11, with 10 general and our Maori constituency, I'm just wondering what my colleagues or the chairman feel with regards to how that, I don't see that it would affect workload. I actually don't see that it would affect the workload, because those councillors that do more always do more, and the ones that do less do less. But I'm just, I worry that 14 is a big beast. I worry that 14 creates factions, and I'm interested in my colleagues' feelings around a smaller number, or what their thoughts have been around a smaller number, and yours, Mr. Chair, because I do have concerns about 14 being a big beast.
Yeah, I suppose just to respond to that, Councillor Staples, I recognise that that issue. I'm not sure that 10 or 11 is the answer, but I perhaps would have a preference for something that got us to 13, but I can't see how that's quite possible under this arrangement without walking into the same inconsistency problems that we already have. So I suppose I'm a little bit resigned to the higher number, which is at the limit of where we can go, because we're bound to the 14 number. We can't go to 15. So from my perspective, and the reason for asking the question about moving the boundary for the Kapiti constituency to perhaps more align with an iwi boundary rather than a local authority boundary, was whether we can mitigate some of the issues that we have with a 33 to 37% overhang by reducing that, but not necessarily eliminating it. So I know that's not that doesn't completely address the issue that you've raised, which is, at some point, do we have not too many councillors, but could we do with less? And my answer to that is yes, of course we could, and we could probably operate as well, with the exception that it's not just about who pulls their weight around the table. It's also about the diversity that we have when we have 14 members versus having 11 or 10. I think we have more diversity as a consequence of that, and because we're an eclectic business, public transport one day, environment the next day, regional parks the next day, we all bring different talents and interests to the table, which play out at different times in different ways. Councillor Conley.
I guess we heard from the submitters, and I do think they made a good point from a logic perspective, or a maths perspective. There was some somewhat beauty in the mathematical model that they proposed, but ultimately, I guess I have to come back to the fact that if it ain't broke, don't fix it. Like, I feel like we are a well-functioning regional council, and I feel like, unfortunately, there are some areas that get underrepresented, but I wouldn't have necessarily put Kapiti at the top of my list. I think Stokes Valley is an area that doesn't get the representation it needs. Both me and Quentin kind of try to cover it from both angles, but ultimately they're a community in of themselves, and no one around this table is from that community. Likewise, Johnsonville, I know that Chris has a strong historical connection with Johnsonville, but nobody
North
around this
Wellington.
table is from that part of Wellington. So I feel like by virtue, and I don't think that problem is going to be made better by making the number smaller. So I do feel like the obligation for us to all work across the region and work in those communities that are sort of bespoke communities but don't have anyone around the table, we've got that impetus currently, and I guess it just wasn't convincing enough to sway me, really. That's where I'm coming from.
Yeah, look, interesting point you raise, Ros, because in the entire time, I can stand corrected on this, but in the entire time of the regional council, since 1989, we have never had a representative in North Wellington. In fact, it almost, until Simon came along, we'd not even had a councillor beyond Kelburn.
Elaborate on that. That's a really good point, because the constituents, pardon? Because constituents in particularly the farming areas of Ohariu have indicated that they really haven't had that representation, and they do appreciate it now. Not pushing my own barrow, but yeah, it's and the other point, if I can just keep going. We do represent a wide area, and we take that oath for Wellington as a whole, and I think that generally speaking, we try and cover that. I found this council really good for talking things out and sharing a bit of the load. And Adrian, for instance, like with Wairarapa and Penny, with Otaki, I feel that that you really do need to listen to those areas, because they're slightly different, and take account of what the issues are there. I think that lessening the membership would probably, as Darren said, create some interesting workload, I'd say.
Ken, then Penny. Yeah, David.
You alluded to 1989. I know I'm going to sound terribly parochial. The Wainuiomata Borough Council disappeared, and just under a month ago, the Hutt City Council narrowly voted to get rid of community boards which were put in place of the Borough Council, and I, along with a couple of other people sitting around the table, were previously part of the district health boards, which in effect disappeared overnight, replaced by one national body representing the 21 DHBs, which in itself lasted a little bit longer than 5 minutes. Had now been run by a commissioner trying to find a $1 million saving, and now we're sitting around debating whether we should reduce the level of democracy on the regional council. The Hutt City Council vote, which was had recently, there was much angst against that decision, especially by the people of Wainuiomata, which are the biggest ward in Hutt. So I'm reluctant to be part of a process that reduces democracy even more than our community, along the lines of what we're discussing. I agree 100% with Ross that if it's not broke, don't fix it. As you know, I was the first Pasifika person elected in nearly 30 years of elections. The Katia was the first. Māori, Gardner was the first.
Burmese.
elected. Equity, diversity, representation, leadership and governance that looks like the community it represents. All of those values and all of those qualities underpin an organisation that, and I don't mean to sound corny, that very proud to be a part of. And I note in the submitters' time they had with us, no reference whatsoever to equity, diversity, where we are now as a society and where we were back in the day. Because if it was just a question, of numbers, well, you might as well put 4 people there, or put a commissioner there. Why bother having any democracy? And we do have concerns, and we debate it every year, and in particular, as we're into the last 12 months before the next cycle, about our low level of participation and engagement. Yeah. And I honestly can't comprehend a notion or a concept where we can increase participation by taking away opportunities. And I don't mean that to sound naive or selfish or self-serving or anything along those lines, but I like the way that we're headed, I like the way that we're structured, and I like the way that we're represented. And I don't support any form of reduction.
Councillor Gallo.
Okay, so who's off here?
No.
I know, well, we're live streamed, aren't we?
Yes.
Yeah, cool. That's a good reminder, thank you. So I do want to say that occasionally I mention that I'm, got an honest degree in political representation. And yes, if you were having the purist approach, probably that 10%, looking at those numbers. And I know that from time to time I mentioned that my votes should be worth 1.5 votes versus 1. That's what you would actually do. And then that would fix everything. But actually, I never need to really do that. And I don't think the submitters have ever perhaps watched us and how we work. And that is the nature and the culture of our council versus the council that actually the submitter has previously been on, which I'm very familiar with, having been around there for many years, more years than he had. And so I'm not going to sit here and go, well, from a purist approach, we go 10, because actually I'm not about saying that another community should be less represented than my own or fiddle with that. And actually, as Roz said, it's not broke. Actually, I feel that for the Kapiti Coast, again, if people did tune in more frequently or had attended in the past when we weren't live streamed, they would have seen how supportive we end up being, because actually we do nail that regional thinking approach that we talk about. We actually do it. We actually do the walk of that talk. Also, KCDC, the Kapiti Coast District Council, with its 5 now community boards, because they went up 1 in the last election, has 31 representatives. So it's kind of ironic that they're giving KCDC as the example. They have 31 representatives, and they're saying for our 13 to go down to 10. It doesn't make sense to me. It's not. Yeah, it blows in the face of the argument. Also, that workload thing. It's not even just about that. Sometimes some people do more than others. Kapiti, with my representation, I really appreciate the privilege of being the chair of a couple of committees and being on the stadium, and then going and being in the Wairarapa committees, and as I did last term. But it's still supposed to be a part-time job. And I don't want to actually fiddle with it, I guess, because I don't want anybody then to go, oh, well, let's not make the Kapiti Coast representative the chair of such and such because of their workload. I actually had to give I'll be honest, and I had to give a bit of an honest conversation with one of the community boards recently who were doing quite regularly undermining the work of me as the representative and of our council. And I said to them, why is your strategy to undermine me? We're all colleagues. Your strategy should be to work with me and support what I'm doing at this table. And that lies the problem of politics. So I called them out on it, and I think they've listened and going to change their strategy. It's not about people undermining us, it's working with us in partnership. So I think we don't go around bagging other councils, I have to say. Not with the mics on, did you say? We're joking. Of course he's joking. So I just want to say, that I can understand the rationale of the numbers down, but actually there's a lot going on that is well beyond the scope of what we call our constituency work, well beyond it. And there actually is quite a lot of committees, and we've got the AGM next week for the, all the other sort of stuff that's going on. That is not in their thinking and their understanding of the work we do as representatives. Thank you.
Okay, Councillor Lee.
Well, thank you. Just to follow on from Councillor Gaylor, if we took quite a clinical approach, the numbers look really good. It does show fair representation if we took a clinical look, but this is not clinical. And it is about representation, and we have to think that we've got to realise that we don't operate, or we shouldn't operate in isolation. We have to work with our TAs, and we just pick on Kapiti. There's already a lot of representation, and one of the submitter, he was on council, and he was the Greater Wellington portfolio holder. So it's not the representation doesn't just stop with our numbers in a constituency. It's also working with the other elected members. Exactly, right. So it's not about just numbers. It's about how effective that representation can be. And in terms of diversity, I think it was in the news a few months ago. They were looking across the nation in terms of the most diverse council. I think they picked on us as the most diverse council, and I think that's what has made us a richer body. I was the first person of Asian descent in, I think, about 150 years, and I was, again, when I was selected on Wellington City Council, I think it was 150 years I was the first person of Asian descent, and now there have been 3, and I was the first, but I don't want to be the last, and that's what we want. And that, I think it's not really about numbers, but numbers do have some importance, and we do want to push those numbers at the ceiling. Thank you.
Okay, Councillor Rupata.
I agree with everybody, and I think if it's not broke, there's nothing here to fix. Actually, Penny, I'm shocked that 31 people are represented in KCDC. That is a lot of people. I think that was the question I might have asked Darren this morning. So I'm not for, I'm for the status quo, frankly, but I do want to say that people are coming to our community. So while we can't answer this question now, I think in the future it is going to be a real question as the Kapiti district grows by 30,000 people in the future, and our outer communities like Puriroa, Plimerton Farms is going to grow. There's going to be more people, and they are going to require more representation in the future. So maybe the question can't be answered now, but it is a question that we should think about in the future. Kia ora.
Yeah, I tend to agree. At the next representation review, just on population numbers, it feels like Wellington is going to have to give a member to somewhere else in the region, just on the fact that at the moment population has been stagnating in Wellington City, but it has been growing in other areas. But that's for for the next review period, I would have thought, and it's just a challenge that we can see coming through. But what I'm picking around the table is that things haven't come to a head where they actually need to be settled out on a different basis at the moment, and there is comfort in the way that things are currently constructed and the diversity that that brings around the council table, which might otherwise be lost. Am I reading the table correctly then to assume that the instruction before we have a break and to allow Francis to construct a recommendation is for the status quo?
I think before you get to that point, Chair, the meeting hasn't considered these options. You've really focused on
option one.
You need to have a discussion on those before you get to that.
Okay, so what Francis is reminding me of is that our discussion has been on alternative proposal 1, but we haven't discussed proposals 2A and 2B. I suppose I had thought that we were actually discussing 2A and 2B at the same time. So I invite any councillors at the moment who have got any observations to make about 2A and 2B to step forward on those issues. I'd taken, for example, Ken's words to be about all of the proposals and any change, and similarly I thought I'd heard the same from Councillor Connolly, Lee, Wolf, Horpata, Gaylor, at the very least. Yeah.
Just on 2A and 2B, they don't solve anything as far as I can see. They maybe they are aiming for that magic number of 13 councillors around the table, but they just in some cases they exacerbate the disproportionality around the table. So I don't really know what more there is to consider from my perspective.
Okay. Councillor Nash.
Yes, I mean, morning everybody. Taking all the possible scenarios presented to us as a whole, I guess that there's basically a trade-off in the decision, as I see it, between dealing with the under/over representation question geographically on the one hand, and on the other hand, maintaining a decent number of councillors to do the work. And it seems to be you can't. None of the scenarios before us do both. You're going to have to trade off between dealing with under representation or having a decent number of councillors. Now, of course, you could say we don't need that many councillors, and that's what the submitter said. But I tend to think actually it's good to have the number of councillors that we have, and even one more would be helpful. If you think there's an amount of work that is going to be done, and it gets divided by the number of councillors, then if you reduce the number of councillors, logically either that means each councillor does more work or less work gets done by the councillors as a whole. There's no other way for that to actually exist as an equation. So I tend to think it's better. And I was thinking about your point, Councillor Staples, around factions, and I don't know whether it's more or less likely to have factions with a larger council, but I do think that if you were to have factions, then it would have more of an impact in a smaller council, because it would be easier for one faction to just control the whole thing, and then you would get less democracy and less good deliberation. So I think on the balance of things there, I feel like, yeah, probably better from on that point to have a wider number rather than a lesser number. So yeah, I think overall, good to stay where we are.
Thanks, Councillor Nash. Look, from my perspective, just wrapping in alternative proposals 2A and 2B, alongside proposal 1, I'll come back to the issue that Councillor Connolly raised. Was it maybe Councillor Wolf? The issue of the warrants that we effectively sign at the beginning of the triennium that bind us to being regional and having a regional perspective. And a reminder from my perspective is that effectively we wouldn't have pushed as hard as we have with success to get the new regional trains, which will largely benefit, which will have a disproportionate benefit for the Kapiti coast if we were myopic and only had a focus on our own little areas of the region. The reality is that we are able to step up and think regionally, and somebody like Councillor Gaylor is well supported by other councillors, as she has signalled herself. She reciprocates with that support and involvement in other parts of the region on other issues, and I think that goes around the table and is one of the hallmarks of success, quite frankly, of this council. When I look across the region, it has maturity, it has diversity, and it has a willingness around this table to engage on issues. That may not change in terms of the numbers, but I suspect that holding the numbers where they are and continuing at least for the next period with the status quo is probably likely to be of greater benefit to us than changing at the moment. So, Francis.
I recommend an adjournment so we can work with you on
Okay.
motion.
So what we propose to do now is adjourn. You can get a cup of coffee and tea. We'll construct a recommendation around this, and then we'll find a mover in a second, and then we can debate that recommendation. Ka pai?
Come back at 10:40.
10:40? Francis and co have diligently worked on a set of 2 recommendations which cover off the submissions and the proposals that have been put forward. Do we have that on this? Okay.
Yes, you do.
So, recommendation 1 adopts the reasons for the rejection of the submissions as set out in the table below. So you've got alternative proposal 1, 2A and 2B, a description of that proposal which you've already seen, and then in the right hand column the rationale for those 3 proposals being rejected, and then finally in recommendation 2, confirmation of the initial representation proposal for the 2025 triennial local elections. So I have a mover in Councillor Staples. Do I have a seconder in Councillor Ropata? Do either of you wish to speak to the paper?
Just briefly, councillors, I greatly appreciated your words, and it makes me feel very comfortable about the decision we're making. Thank you.
Just to reinforce what Adrian said, I appreciated the conversation too, and it actually helped me make some really good decisions about today and the future. Kia ora.
Kia ora. Any other councillors wish to speak to the recommendations? Councillor Conley?
I just floated an alternative, which was Upper Hutt have more representatives, given the water comes from there, and you know, I just putting it out there as an option. But you know,
She's got a couple.
Is that an amendment? Okay. Any other councillors? No, I think it's been a good debate, good consideration. Based, I must say, and I think many of you have recognised this, on 2 really good quality submissions. That this is not the first time we've had to consider these issues. The issues put in front of us in the submissions were not new, but they certainly were well considered in relation to the Kapiti district side of things in particular. So without to call for the vote, all those in favour? All those against? That's a majority, that's unanimous support. Paper carried. Thank you very much. Thank you, councillors. So just before we wrap up, Francis is going to explain where this goes to now.
Thank you, Chair. The next step is the Chair will provide a report to the Council meeting on the 31st of October, setting out the committee's recommendations for Council adoption. On the assumption Council adopts the committee's recommendations, the final proposal will be the same as the initial proposal that's gone out for submissions. What that means is that the final proposal will only be open to appeals, and those appeals can only be made by the submitters who've submitted on the initial proposal. So in essence, it's open to the 2 persons who've made submissions that you have before you today. It's not open to broader submissions from the general public. Well, that would be a matter for them to determine, but the appeals must be based on the matters they've raised in their submissions. The period for appeal is at least 3 weeks, and if any appeals are received, we're required to forward those to the Local Government Commission, and it will then consider those matters and issue its determination. Nominally, there's a placeholder for a commission hearing in March. However, it will be up to the Commission whether it decides to have a hearing or simply consider the matters on the papers, which has been its previous practice with regard to this Council.
Okay. Anuhia, ki te urutapu nui, ki wātia, ki mama, te ngākau, te tinana. Te wairua I te ara takata, koia rā e rongo, whakaria ake ki runga, kia tina, tina, hui e, tai ki e. Thank you, councillors. Good discussion.